Well, it's gotten quiet, so I think that means it's time for our second session. I'd first like to take care of a couple of things. We should have mentioned in our list of publications, actually, from the Historical Society and the Federation, the publications that we have cooperated with the Federation on, we omitted one of them, an important one that came out recently, Remembering Cleveland's Jewish Voices, a selection of primary sources from the archives that was just published in 2011 by Kent State University Press. Sally Wertheim, whom you will hear from in a moment, was one of the co-editors of the volume with Alan Bennett. We think of it as an especially important volume because it complements Emerging Traditions, our photographic essay, images from the archives with the primary sources from the archives as well. So you can find there actually some documents certainly related to many of the themes that we'll be talking about. We are very grateful this morning that Dr. Hasia Diner from New York University has agreed to moderate the panel. And I should also say that she will also be speaking at the Maltz Museum at 2 p.m. And providing some larger context for us. So let me turn over the microphone.
Okay, great. Okay, hi, so welcome back, and I am merely introducing this session, and I think I'll introduce each speaker as they come up, so I'll kind of pop up a few times. So the first paper for this late morning, early afternoon session is by Ira Robinson. It's actually one of the people speaking here who I've known as a colleague. He is speaking on Orthodox Judaism in Cleveland. He is professor of Judaic Studies in the Department of Religion at Concordia University in Montreal. He is the president of the Canadian Society for Jewish Studies, past president of the Association for Canadian Jewish Studies, which was formerly known as the Canadian Jewish Historical Society, and he's been the past president of the Jewish Public Library in Montreal. He is the editor of the Cyrus Adler papers, and really has been one of the major figures in the study of American Orthodoxy, who in the last few decades in our profession. So, Ira.
To be here. I have 20 minutes and I could speak till the cows come home, but I'm not going to. I want to make a little bit of a methodological preface, though. In this attempt to sketch the evolution of Orthodox Jewry in Cleveland from its 19th century beginnings to the present, I am mindful of a couple of facts. Number one, a comprehensive historical account of Orthodoxy in this, or indeed in any individual major North American Jewish community, hasn't yet been attempted. This is, in fact, by way of being a pioneering study. And the only small approximation of what this thing attempts to do is a book I wrote a few years ago on the Eastern European Orthodox immigrant rabbinic community in Montreal called Rabbis and Their Community. So that's point number one. This is a pioneering effort. And second methodological point, the primary sources for this study are extraordinarily rich. They include many rich archival sources housed in the Western Reserve Historical Society Library. They include a wealth of newspaper archives in Yiddish, in English, and therefore, what I have been forced to do is what archaeologists are forced to do when they don't have the time or the person power to uncover the entire site. They dig an exploratory trench here, and an exploratory trench there, and here they find a gate, and there they find a foundation, and what's in between? Well, that's by guess and by God. So I'm going to start with a short discussion of the Judaic life of the earliest Jewish settlers in Cleveland, prior to what we can call Orthodox Judaism, because Orthodox Judaism itself arises, both the term and the reality, from the rise of Reform Judaism, which comes in strong in the United States in the mid-19th century. Major issues that I deal with include the religious life of the Eastern European immigrant community in the 19th century, late 19th century to the Second World War, synagogues, communal organizations, the rabbinate, Jewish education, kashrut. The account of the post-World War II period highlights the significance of the establishment of the Telz Yeshiva in Cleveland in 1941, and will also deal with issues of Jewish education, synagogues, kashrut, and relations between the Orthodox community and non-Orthodox Jews. And finally, I hope to briefly survey the state of the Orthodox Jewish community in Cleveland at the beginning of the 21st century, with an emphasis on the impact of Orthodox educational institutions on this community. When the first Jews come to Cleveland from Bavaria, they came with hardly any notion that Judaism could mean anything other than the traditional rabbinic Judaism that existed in their ancestral home. Now, certainly they understood that people could observe Judaism more or less. They could be more or less neglectful of the laws and customs of Judaism. And indeed, the Uns Leben document pointedly warns them that they should not turn away from the religion of our fathers. Don't tear yourselves away from the laws which your fathers and mothers searched for assurance and found it. So they had the idea, you could be observant of the Jewish religion or not, and you should be, but there was that. But the idea that there is a non-traditional Judaism, that's going to come. And therefore, when in the 1840s, Jews in Cleveland began to create synagogues, they were designed to adhere as closely as possible to the only model of synagogue these people had known. And Lloyd Gartner, somewhat anachronistically, describes the first Cleveland synagogues as the two little Orthodox congregations, Anshe Chesed and Tifereth Israel. Now, once again, they weren't Orthodox because Orthodox implies the presence of a religious alternative, which was then coalescing in Europe and was coming to the United States, and indeed had made its appearance even earlier in Charleston, South Carolina, but really impacts Cleveland only at mid-19th century. And when Reform does appear as an alternative expression of Judaism that speaks cogently to the social and religious situation of American Jews, Gartner does note that certain Reform tendencies appear. Okay, nonetheless, both Tifereth Israel and Anshe Chesed remain traditional for several years. Anshe Chesed housing a mikveh for ritual purification, and both congregations employing shochtim. Now, we come to the late 19th century, and reform is very triumphant in the established Jewish community in Cleveland as throughout the United States. And when the Eastern European Jews begin appearing in Cleveland, they look to the established, mostly acculturated Jewish community of Cleveland as marginal to them, both economically and religiously, and as Orthodox, regardless of their personal level of religious observance, which ranged from really a lot to not at all. But they were a residual, Orthodox had become, at this point, a residual category. In 1895, Emma Davis broadly and negatively characterizes these Jewish immigrants as those bigoted followers of the Orthodox rabbinical law, whose minds are stunted, whose characters are warped, and who have become adepts and have grown wily in the evasions of law. So there's a mindset at work here. Now let's look at these marginal people. In a Cleveland newspaper article in 1887, Orthodox synagogues are portrayed as showing, quote, the dark side of the European ghetto. So what do we know about the synagogues of Cleveland, a city that Rabbi Solomon Goldman characterized in the early 20th century as, quote, the most synagogue-minded city in the country? Well, the first thing to know is that synagogues proliferated. The first Eastern European congregation of Polish Jews was apparently founded in 1857. And congregations of Polish Jews, Lithuanian Jews, Hungarian Jews are founded in the 1860s. At the turn of the 20th century, the Jewish Encyclopedia article on Cleveland counts no less than 11 minor congregations, mostly Russian, with a combined membership of 700. The largest of them, Beth Midrash Hagadol Beth Israel, having 600 seat holders. Now note that these are all minor congregations, including one with a membership of 600. So once again, you understand that the mindset of the writer of the Jewish Encyclopedia article on Cleveland is of the German Jewish community for whom these people, Eastern European immigrants, are marginal. So the first volume of the American Jewish Yearbook lists also 11 Eastern European congregations. Gartner states in 1923 the number of Orthodox congregations to have been 16. 17 were listed in the 1935 Cleveland Directory. Now, Cleveland followed the pattern of most large American Jewish communities. First and foremost, congregations were established and split on the basis of European places of origin, Lithuania, Hungary. Another criteria was liturgy. Some congregations prayed in the Ashkenazic liturgy prevalent in much of Eastern Europe. Others, like the Nussachari congregation founded in 1906, that was apparently Hasidic. And there was ultimately actually a Hasidic rabbi, Harav HaTzadik Meir Leifer, who became the rabbi of Congregation Anshe Marmorish B'nai Yaakov and founded a dynasty as the Clevelander Rebbe, though he is now, the present Clevelander Rebbe is now resident in Williamsburg, Brooklyn, but that's a whole other story. Sabbath observed, but it's a very interesting and quite important issue, because some communities, like Montreal, attracted a large and significant Hasidic population, and others like Cleveland had and lost. And the question, once again, methodologically, we have to look and say and ask the question, why? Okay. Sabbath observance is another criterion. For the most part, Eastern European synagogues in Cleveland were conducted for internal purposes, completely traditionally, but most of their members, due to prevalent economic necessities, were not strict observers of the Jewish Sabbath, and jobs enabling people to strictly observe the Jewish Sabbath and holidays were few and far between. On the other hand, there were some congregations in Cleveland whose name and constitution indicated we are Shomer Shabbos. There's a Cleveland congregation that exists to this day on South Taylor Road, the Shomer Shabbos, for good reason. Still another issue leading to the proliferation of synagogues was internal strife. One of the large issues, should men and women be seated separately or together? B'nai Jeshurun started mixed seating in 1904, and that led to the founding of an Orthodox breakaway congregation, Ohev Tzedek. Anshe Emet had debated this issue as early as the 1880s, but in the 1920s, when it went mixed seating, there was an explosion which led to a landmark court case and also led to the increasingly clear line of demarcation between Orthodox and conservative Judaism in America, which I'm dealing with in a separate article. I'm presenting it at a separate conference later this year, but this is a wholly owned subsidiary of this article. Now, the communal organizations. In the early 20th century, Eastern European Orthodox Jews had arrived in sufficient number in Cleveland, had acquired sufficient experience in their land to realize that they had not achieved recognition on the part of the established Cleveland Jewish community to which they thought they were entitled. By the 19-teens, there are demands of, for instance, the Council Educational Alliance, that the Orthodox element of the community, read Eastern European Jews, be more represented on the board. And the Educational Alliance indeed responded by placing several prominent Eastern European Jews, representatives of the quote-unquote Orthodox, to the board, but the issue didn't rest. In 1923, the Jewish Federation of Cleveland commissioned a report by Samuel Goldsmith surveying the current situation of the Cleveland community. And that report pinpointed the discontent of the Orthodox as a major issue to be confronted by federation. And in this spirit, for instance, Goldsmith recommended that the Jewish hospital, Mount Sinai, should provide kosher food for its patient, despite, quote, the personal customs or attitudes of the members of the Board of Trustees that held that kosher food really wasn't all that necessary. Anyway, the recommendations of the Goldsmith report weren't certainly not implemented immediately, and certainly not to the satisfaction of the Orthodox. And in the financially lean times of the Great Depression, the Federation refused to financially rescue Orthodox institutions, leaving an acute mutual bitterness that lasted for decades. Okay, the rabbinate. There were a number of Orthodox rabbis, Eastern European immigrant Orthodox rabbis, who came to Cleveland to serve their community. They shared a commitment to the Talmudic culture and Judaic law in which they had been educated, but like the laity, they were divided by their geographic origins. Rabbis and other Jews hailing from Lithuania, for instance, did not get along with rabbis or other Jews of Hungarian origin, and vice versa. They were also divided because there were so few opportunities for Yiddish-speaking immigrant Orthodox rabbis to make anything resembling a decent living. The synagogues they presided over were not in a position to give them an adequate salary, or indeed a salary at all. And so most of them depended to a greater or lesser extent on a position of some sort within the kosher meat industry in Cleveland, ideally as a rabbinic supervisor, or failing that in positions of lesser prestige and income, like shochtim, slaughterers, mashgichim, inspectors. And there was never enough work like that to go around. There was an extremely tight economic competition, and yet, despite this, all of these inherently divisive forces, in the first decades of the 20th century, there were a number of notable attempts to try to unite the Orthodox community and rabbinate. And there were equally powerful or even more powerful forces militating against such unity. The first instance that we know about of an attempted unity happened in the 1890s. Then there was a Council of Cleveland Rabbis around 1918. There was an attempt to create a chief rabbinate in Cleveland in the early 1920s. And there was, in fact, a rabbi, his name was Benjamin Gittelson, who died in 1932, came to Cleveland in 1890. He had a career of 40 years in Cleveland, and at his death in 1932, he was referred to as Zakan HaRabbonim, the elder of the rabbis. In other words, kind of not exactly a chief rabbi, but certainly a primus inter pares. Now, he didn't succeed in uniting it. And another important rabbi of this era, of the early 20th century, is a man whose career in Cleveland, he never vied for the job of chief rabbi, but his impact was nonetheless very important. His name was Rabbi Samuel Margulies. He came to Cleveland with a unique preparation for the American Orthodox rabbinate. He was the son of one of the most prominent Eastern European immigrant rabbis in America, Rabbi Moshe Zvulun Margulies, the Ramaz. And his father sent him back to Europe for yeshiva training. And when he returned to America after about 8 years in yeshiva, he entered Harvard College and graduated Harvard class of 1902. So he comes with both Judaic and American culture. The Telzer Yeshiva in Telz and Harvard College in Cambridge. And he came to be the rabbi in 1904 of Anshe Emet, with the ability to preach and interact with his congregants in English as well as in Yiddish. And his rabbinical duties included encouraging the establishment of an Orthodox congregation in Glenville, Beth Tfilah, which ultimately merged with Anshe Emet in 1916, gave rise to the formation of the Jewish Center in the early 1920s. And he is the first truly English-speaking Orthodox spokesman in Cleveland, and he had a leadership role in a number of initiatives, including the Union of Jewish Organizations, 1906-1909, a Cleveland branch of the Union of Orthodox Jewish Congregations of America, the Cleveland Kehillah, and of course, he is noted as a founder of the Cleveland Hebrew School. The Orthodox rabbi who had over a decades-long career in Cleveland most approximated the primus inter pares after Gittelson was Rabbi Israel Porath. In 1925, Rabbi Porath came to Cleveland for a convention and was offered a job, which he accepted. He brought to Cleveland a rabbinic erudition acquired in his home in Jerusalem, but also an ability to articulate an almost flawless English. We have in the Western Reserve Historical Society his inaugural sermon, 1925, from Oeb Tzedek in, as I said, an almost flawless grammatical English. By 1927, Porath was visibly taking a leading role in the Orthodox rabbinate, but he didn't achieve his leadership position quite at this point, because in 1929, certain members of the Orthodox community imported Rabbi Judah Levenberg from New Haven, Connecticut, with a clear purpose to make him the primary Orthodox rabbi in Cleveland, and to make his yeshiva, which he brought with him from New Haven, the nucleus of an experiment in establishing an institution of higher Talmudic learning in the United States. Levenberg's was a failed attempt, of which more in a minute. The Jews of Cleveland, the Orthodox Jews of Cleveland, sent their children to the Cleveland public school system through the 1940s. Until then, they got their Jewish education entirely in institutions supplementary to the public school education. And Rabbi Margulies expressed the nearly universal opinion of Cleveland Jews when he said, "We do not favor parochial schools." That's going to change. What were the alternatives available? Well, one is the Sunday school. And the Sunday school sounds very Reform because in this community, in this Cleveland Orthodox community, Reform was a large influence. There are Orthodox congregations or congregations calling themselves Orthodox that have confirmation of their young people, obviously borrowed from Reform, who have Sunday schools as well as Hebrew schools. Here's Rabbi Porath talking about his own congregation's Sunday school, which was, incidentally, by far its most populated educational offering. And he said, "I must admit that I am not too much an advocator," sick. Now, you see, once again, it's almost flawless English. "I am not too much of an advocator of the Sunday school system. If parents think that they do their best by sending their little ones on Sunday only for 2 hours, they make a big mistake. If you want your children to become acquainted with Jewish religion, to be able to daven and read, you must send them at the Hebrew Daily." Well, the Hebrew Daily is the afternoon Hebrew school. And once again, Samuel Margulies is a major founder of the Cleveland Hebrew school system that is taken over by Friedland. But there is also a much more traditionalist Orthodox attempt at supplementary Jewish education. It's called Yeshiva Adath B'nai Yisrael, or YABI for short. It's founded in 1915 in large part as a kind of a counter movement, a protest against the liberal orientation of the Cleveland Hebrew schools. And here's where things get very interesting, because in Yabi, and indeed in the Cleveland Hebrew school system, you got people learning the Bible, people learning the prayer book. One thing they are not studying is Talmud. Rabbi Porath, in an article in 1945, estimated that in all of Cleveland, and we're talking about a community of tens of thousands of Jews, there may be 25 or 30 young people studying Gemara. And there may be 4 Cleveland Jews who are studying at any higher yeshiva. Things are going to change there too. But once again, you understand that Rabbi Porath is a man who is in a position to know, and if he is, and I happen to, because once again, there are lots of Talmudic learning going on. There are shiurim in various synagogues, and Rabbi Porath describes them, and you can see mentions in the Cleveland Yiddish paper, the Yiddische Welt, of others, including, interestingly, a Gemara shiur that is conducted not in Yiddish as normal, but in Hebrew. Anyway, lots of interesting things, no time. Kashrut. Kashrut, as I said earlier, is a very conflictual situation, and it is conflictual in community after community throughout North America, but here in Cleveland, by all observers, it is worse. It is worse. Here's what Rabbi Porath has to say about kashrut in Cleveland. It has embittered our communal life for decades, constantly brought with it so much desecration, chilul Hashem, and distress, agmas nefesh, that it seemed that kosher meat and conflict are Siamese twins that cannot be separated. As I said, observer after observer said, and it is true, kashrut is nasty throughout North America. It is nastier in Cleveland. And I don't have too much time, but I just want to give you some idea of what is going on in Cleveland. In 1932, in 1932, Rabbi Levenberg, remember he's the guy who has come from New Haven to replant his yeshiva and to become the big cheese in the Orthodox Jewish community. Well, he attempts to unite the Orthodox rabbinate of Cleveland and its lay leadership to solve the problem of kashrut under his leadership. And the attempt embraced almost all Orthodox rabbis, but predictably not all of them. And here's an interesting thing. He decided, or his group decided, they were going to form their Beit Din, their rabbinic court, on the basis of elections. Now, this is unique in my understanding, and I've put the word out to various people. I think it's unique. And my working hypothesis is the following. We're in the state of Ohio. In the state of Ohio, all judges are elected by free and popular ballot. And judges in the Cleveland Court of Common Pleas, or indeed the Supreme Court of Ohio, get their mandate from the people. Rabbi Levenberg and his attempted to create have an election that attracted over 3,000 voters. who included women as well as men. And this is by no means a given because there are lots of Orthodox rabbis. Okay, I'm going to wrap up in just a minute. I don't have time for a whole bunch of things, just to say, just to fill in that Rabbi Levenberg was denounced by one of his opponents as a racketeer. He was arrested by the Cleveland police, held in a holding cell, and only released after a day. There was much to do, and there is much more to say, but I'm out of time. Thank you.
I'm sorry to have been the bad guy to end that delightful presentation. Our next paper is on Abraham Hayyim Friedland and the structures of Jewish education. There's co-presentation by Sylvia Abrams and Lifsa Schachter. So let me just introduce them. Sylvia Abrams is currently teaching for the Siegel Lifelong Learning. She's the former director of the Jewish Education Center of Cleveland, past president of CAGE, the Coalition for the Advancement of Jewish Education, and the chair of the Cleveland Jewish Archives Advisory Committee. Lifsa Schachter is the author of the Hebrew Through Movement curriculum, professor emerita of the Siegel College of Judaic Studies, served at the Siegel College as chair of the Department of Education and as dean, and also taught at the Jewish Theological Seminary. So I don't know how you're going to handle the dual presentation, but I leave it to you within the time period, though.
Yeah, you can just give us a signal. I'm going to introduce the paper, and then Sylvia will do the overview and the issues that we want to explore further. I want to start with a few comments about how we became interested in this topic. We are both, as you heard, professional Jewish educators with strong connections to a building in Cleveland whose official name is Bet Friedland. Some years ago, when we realized that few people, including many who worked in that building, even knew who Friedland was, we decided to undertake an initiative to restore the community awareness to the giant who once worked in this community. Our first attempt was to locate people who had worked with him, who had been his students, or who had collaborated with him in communal efforts. For the most part, we did gather some interesting material, but we were a few years too late. The generation that really knew him was largely gone. We were therefore very glad that this project and the invitation to participate in it gave us the impetus to expand our original initiative. We have used the archival material from the Western Reserve Historical Society. Friedland's papers are in Cincinnati because the archives here did not yet exist, and we have not yet explored those papers, but we will. We've looked at material in Hebrew, some of it never yet translated to English, and to many secondary sources on Cleveland history, Jewish education, and culture. We plan to explore, in today's presentation, we will present the overview of the paper, develop some sections more fully, and indicate others which require more research. And of course, we will welcome comments, feedback, and suggestions. Abraham Hayyim Friedland, widely known as Chet Aleph, the initials of his Hebrew name, came to Cleveland in 1921 to serve as superintendent of the Cleveland Hebrew schools. 3 years later, he became the founding education director of the Cleveland Bureau of Jewish Education. He served in these dual capacities until his death in 1939. He was an innovative educator, a gifted poet, a national leader of both the Zionist and the Hebraist movements in America. Though a transformational leader, his personal vision often conflicted with those of the leaders of the organizations he led. Our paper examines the context in which Friedland worked, the personal and cultural underpinnings of the cultural national Jewish education he espoused, how his vision played out in the Cleveland community, and the nature of his legacy both locally and nationally. It consists of 4 main sections: the sociological and historical context surrounding his arrival to Cleveland, his biography, paideia, educational contributions, and stature as a Hebrew poet, his role as a communal and national leader, and finally, the impact and legacy of his work. We explore the structures of Jewish education created during this seminal period and the extent to which they persisted. We also examine the tensions created by the different visions of Jewish education and often conflicting agendas held by practitioners and lay leaders. And finally, we want to make explicit this profound legacy that he left in Cleveland.
I'm going to tell you a little bit from each of the sections we plan to do, and will indicate the areas that we plan to do further research. So first, let me tell you about the social and historical context surrounding Friedland's move to Cleveland. Cleveland in 1920 was the 5th largest city in the United States. In 1920, the Cleveland Indians won the World Series. The previous decade had seen the establishment of such cultural institutions as the Cleveland Museum of Art, the Cleveland Orchestra, the Cleveland Playhouse, and the Cleveland Metro Parks. In the area of philanthropy, the Cleveland Foundation and the Community Fund Campaign were inaugurated. New villages were established, among them Shaker Heights, Gates Mills, and Beechwood, names to remember as we move through. After a 1915 Cleveland Foundation study, Cleveland's public schools underwent a series of reforms that centralized decision-making and established junior high schools. Robinson S. Jones served as superintendent from 1920 to 1935. He established the Major Works program for gifted students. And here we're going to include more information on changes in general education that influenced Friedland's work, especially the movement toward Basel readers and reading lists. Jones' administration also emphasized vocational and special education classes. Alfred Benish, a prominent lawyer, was elected to the Cleveland Board of Education and served from 1925 to 1962. He also would become a vice president of the Bureau of Jewish Education. These ties initiated cordial relations between the public schools and Jewish educational interests, which would become very important during Friedland's tenure here in Cleveland. Cleveland's Jewish population was a mixture of Jews of German ancestry, and we've heard quite a bit about that from those who have spoken before us. In 1921, Cleveland Jews lived in the old Woodland neighborhood, the emerging middle-class Glenville area, and the more working-class Mount Pleasant Kinsman area. As has been mentioned by others, there were 2 large Reform temples, Tifereth Israel, known as the Temple, led by Rabbi Abba Hillel Silver, and Anshe Chesed, known as Euclid Avenue Temple, led by Rabbi Barnett Brickner. Both rabbis were active in local, national, and international Zionist circles, where they frequently clashed with one another. Anshe Emet, known as the Jewish Center, moved to Glenville in the 1920s, where it was a center of social, intellectual, and Zionist activities. And as was mentioned earlier, in the mid-20s, it affiliated with the conservative movement. B'nai Yeshurun, originally the Hungarian congregation and conservative since the early 1900s, relocated to Cleveland Heights in 1926. There were numerous Orthodox congregations, and when Friedland arrived in 1921, his strong views were added to the controversial nature of local Zionist politics. Cleveland Jews sent their children to the public schools, who saw their role as Americanization of all immigrants. There were as yet no schools that combined Jewish and secular studies. The preferred method of Jewish education for most immigrant families was the afternoon Hebrew school. The first Talmud Torah, known as the Sir Moses Montefiore Hebrew School, was established in 1885 and emphasized traditional religious studies. Then the Flock Garber Cheder was founded in 1904, which emphasized Hebrew language and nationalism. In 1907, the two schools combined, and the name remaining Talmud Torah until 1913, when it became officially the Cleveland Hebrew Schools. And during this period, depending on what you're reading, all the way up to World War II, it's sometimes called the Cleveland Hebrew Schools, it's sometimes called the Talmud Torahs. It always is meant to be the Cleveland Hebrew Schools is the organization. In 1920, prior to Friedland's arrival, it educated 900 schools in its main facility on East 55th Street and at a branch in Glenville. There were also numerous other schools. I'm not going to take the time now to delineate them. Jewish leaders were active in the life of the city in Zionist politics and the Jewish Community Center, Jewish Community Federation, which was called the Federation of Jewish Charities until 1926. Because of interlocking leadership roles, some individuals brought disagreements from one setting into another. In particular, those individuals active on the Cleveland Hebrew Schools Board were naturally drawn to the Zionist groups because of a shared vision for the need for Hebrew in a revived Jewish national home in Palestine. And after the Bureau of Jewish Education was created in 1924, these quarrels interrupted there as well. And here is a quote about that. Quote, Rabbi Abba Hillel Silver's quarrels with the leaders of the Bureau of Jewish Education were still worse than those of the Zionist district. Many of the struggles in the district were actually originated in the Bureau, where H.A. Friedland, Aaron Garber, Alfred Sachs, Max Corman, George Klein, Rabbi Brickner, and others were always feuding with Silver, who was then president of the Bureau. Close quote. So that's the context in which our paper is dealing. Now I'd like to tell you a little bit about Friedland's biography that will give you which we're going to do in great detail. Friedland shared a common background of intensive Jewish study in Europe, a commitment to a national cultural view of Jewish history and peoplehood, a belief in the study of Hebrew language as the foundation of Jewish identity and Jewish survival, and a strong Zionist orientation with many of the Jewish educators in America who were at that time beginning to staff the bureaus of Jewish education and teacher training institutions opening around the country. Together with many of them, he belonged to Zionist youth movements. At the same time, he had an independent personality. He was not involved with the group called the Benderly Boys, which some of you are probably aware of, was the group associated with Dr. Samson Benderly of the New York Bureau of Jewish Education. So let me tell you a little bit about his life that will affect his tenure in Cleveland. In 1910, let's see, he developed in a school called the Beit Sefer Leumi, a school for girls in New York City, known in English as the National School. And he was one of the founders of the school, and this was 5 short years after he came to America. Previous presentations this morning talked about the quickness with which certain immigrants became part of American life. Well, Friedland arrived at age 14 with a reputation as an Ilui, a prodigy, well-versed in Talmudic studies, and he was a published Hebrew poet. He made his way to Columbia University and its Teachers College, where he was familiar with the work of John Dewey and a student of Thorndike and Kilpatrick. He also attended the Teachers Institute of the Jewish Theological Seminary, where he became under the influence of Rabbi Mordechai Kaplan. By the age of 19, he was the president of Beit Sefer Leumi. He was the principal of Beit Sefer Leumi. Within a few short years, it gained a reputation as a model school and drew visitors from around the United States. When Friedland developed his educational paideia at the school, he lived in a brownstone which was located on the top floor with his parents. There was no clear boundary between his home and his school, which will also continue in his work in Cleveland. He was committed to an education based on joy, creativity, the arts, and the development of leadership. There are many memoirs that have captured the spirit of the school, and we will detail those much further in our paper. In Cleveland, Friedland's educational work can be divided into two broad categories. The administrative, in which he sought to extend the Cleveland Hebrew School so that it would become the dominant form of Jewish education in the community, and to build institutions that would make this possible, such as founding a teacher training institution and sponsoring community-wide events to reach the broader adult community. And the educational, which would include creating materials for learning, developing approaches to reading which draw much from parallels in his period in public education. And when we write the full paper, we're going to do a great deal more on his educational innovations than we have time for here. We want to especially talk about Sipurim Yafim, his seminal series of children's readers, his use of dance and movement, choirs, theaters, camp, his intergenerational and communal learning, his focus on citywide events, inviting major Hebrew writers to the entire community, his citywide programs, his use of public spaces like movie theaters for films and sing-alongs, and his distribution of free holiday educational materials. And we have examples of every single one of those, and depending on how long the chapter is how much detail we'll give on those. Okay. In terms of Friedland's role as a communal leader, I just want to give you a little bit about the background of how he came to be at the Bureau of Jewish Education, and then we'll move from there to what his legacy was. So in 1923, soon after his assumption of the position of superintendent of the Cleveland Hebrew Schools, he made a case to the Federation Board of Trustees that not more than 8,000 of the 18,000 potential students were enrolled in any form of Jewish education. He urged the Federation to provide more stable funding for his institution. At the same time, in 1923, there was a survey undertaken by the Federation about forming a Bureau of Jewish Education, and meetings on this took place in 1924 with Rabbi Silver serving as temporary chairman. From the beginning, the organizing committee wanted the Bureau to not be primarily financial, but, quote, a federation of Jewish educational institutions, close quote. The committee to engage an executive director made inquiries all through the country, and they reported back that everyone said that they had in Mr. Friedland a man eminently capable of directing the development of Jewish education. And the same reports suggested that they required someone to take care of money raising in addition to the educational work. So though Friedland legendarily in all the writings is listed as the founding director of the Bureau of Jewish Education, he was the first director of education, and there is a man whose name has fallen off of history totally, who we learned about, whose name was Alfred H. Sachs, who was hired to do the money raising. He had been at JTS in Columbia, and then had been business manager of the Yiddish Welt, the Yiddish paper, and he was recommended by Samuel Rocker. So we found this another example of the interlocking relationships of professional and lay leaders in terms of appointments in Jewish education. Friedland comes to his role at the Bureau because of his reputation nationally for his colleagues, and Sachs comes through the lay leaders who know Sam Rocker. He made all of $4,000 in his job, and the financial model adopted at this time was so discouraging that by 1928 it was abandoned. In 1932, the Bureau becomes a beneficiary of the Federation. Sachs becomes a banker and a lay leader. Then when we do the paper, we're going to tell you a lot more about all the infrastructure and things that Friedland did in the community. And we're not going to try to list those all now. We also want to tell you in much more detail about what he transferred from Beit Sefer Leumi into the ways he ran things in Cleveland. And we'll want to give you a lot about him as a poet. So I'd like to just conclude with what we feel is his impact and legacy. Friedland became ill during the 1930s. He juggled his local roles as superintendent of the Cleveland Hebrew Schools, the Teacher Institute, and director of the Bureau of Jewish Education. During this period, he attracted a number of outstanding scholars to staff the college programs and serve as branch principals of the Hebrew schools. As early as 1931, Friedland recommended opening a Cleveland Hebrew School branch in Cleveland Heights. In 1934, Friedland and Samuel Goldhammer, executive director of the Jewish Community Federation, began planning for a major study of Jewish education. I.B. Berkson of New York and Ben Rosen of Philadelphia, both Benderly boys, were hired to do the study with research provided by Friedland. In 1936, the community hosted a tribute dinner for him. During his final years, Friedland intensified his involvement with national causes dear to him. Most poignantly, he returned to his early interest in Hebrew poetry and succeeded in producing 3 volumes of Hebrew sonnets, which now ensure his stature as a major American Hebrew poet. When he died in 1939, the community decided to raise funds for a Friedland Foundation. And Beit Friedland, which we mentioned at the beginning, which is located at 2030 South Taylor Road, was dedicated in 1953. That's how long it took. The recommendations from the 1936 Berkson report, which had been postponed because of Friedland's illness, were then considered. Ezra Shapiro became president of the Bureau. A rabbi never again served as the lay leader. A man named Medini, who we'll mention earlier in detail in our paper, took over as superintendent of the Cleveland Hebrew School, and Azriel Eisenberg became bureau director, separating these 2 positions and thus effectively undermining the charges that the bureau showed too much favoritism for the Cleveland Hebrew schools. Now quickly, I just want to mention the many structures that Friedland created that survived into this 21st century. The high school department of the Cleveland Hebrew Schools became an independent agency known as Akiva in the 1960s. It continues to function today as the most Hebrew-oriented and vibrant address for Cleveland's high school students outside the day schools. The Cleveland Hebrew Schools continue to offer Hebrew Zionist education in branches in the various suburbs to which the Jews migrated throughout the later 20th century. It served Jewish families with this form of intensive Hebrew education until the 1980s, when it then began to struggle in the face of synagogue pressure for more religiously centered Jewish education and the growth of day schools. Finally, the school closed in 2009 after years of dwindling enrollments and failed attempts to redefine its mission. The College Institute became the Institute for Jewish Studies in 1952 and an accredited College of Jewish Studies in 1963, later named Laura and Alvin Siegel College of Judaic Studies. And that institution stayed in existence until 2012 when it merged into Case Western Reserve as the Siegel Lifelong Learning Program. The Bureau of Jewish Education underwent several changes in strategic direction post-World War II. We're going to detail them more because of time. I'm not going to go into all of them. In 1993, after the Federation's Continuity Commission, the Continuity Commission and the Bureau's activities were merged, and the combined agency's name was changed to Jewish Education Center of Cleveland. Okay. So Friedland's educational legacy was maintained through the decades he had trained and coordinated the publication of Sipurim Yafim. But the creative, art-based, communal and intergenerational out-of-the-box approaches to education he embodied diminished significantly with his passing, and over time they were actually forgotten. When in the 90s, the Continuity Commission brought many of these things back, many people thought they were new approaches. They had no idea that they had been done before. No one seemed to be aware that almost a century earlier, all of these approaches were vibrant and flourishing in the community due to the creativity and passion of Chet Aleph Friedland.
Thank you, and again, I'm sorry to have.
Well, we got enough of it in.
Okay, so our final on talk, oh, sorry, okay. Okay, so I'll take away my apology. So our final paper for this session is Sally Wertheim, Jewish Education in Cleveland in the late 20th century. She is the Dean Emerita and Professor Emerita of History of Education at John Carroll University and past president of the Jewish Federation of Cleveland.
What? Yeah, no, I know. Thank you, Hasia. And I want to reassure all of you that I will gear my presentation, and I'm very cognizant of the time, so we'll adjourn as expected. And I know it's very important, at least for me personally, to get feedback from all of you and to hear your questions, so I can be very flexible. Okay? Okay, well, I am going to, as was said, be talking about Jewish education in Cleveland in the latter part of the 20th century and into the 21st century. So there is some overlap. And I'm so thankful we're having this opportunity to hear from each other, because then we can get that worked out. We're good friends and there's no problem. And I'm very interested in getting feedback from you, and because that's part of the value of this for me. So if there's time or whenever you catch me, I would love to be able to do that. So let me tell you a little bit about what I am going to be focusing on and writing about, given the fact that I'm a historian of American education. And consequently, I think it's very important to place what's happening in Jewish education during the period I'm writing about within the context of what was happening in American education at that time, because the influence is very strong and always has been, I guess, in many respects. So going back just a little bit into the context in American education, and taking you back to the 19th century, it's very interesting because in 1884, the Catholic bishops came together in what was then the Third Plenary Council. It was a way for them, and called for the establishment of a Catholic school, of a Catholic system of education. And they said, to quote, "Near every church there must be a school." So this was the beginning of the parochial school movement as we know it today, which is very strong and very well respected and does a very good job. Interestingly enough, in the Jewish community, and I've often wondered why we do not find this type of thing, and what we actually find is the opposite. That the Jewish community, and if you read some of those documents, was talking about assimilation and not wanting to have a separate system of education, but rather sending their children to the public schools. And I think Ira discussed that in his paper just a little earlier about even the Orthodox sending their children to the public schools, because that was very important. And remember, a lot of these were German Jews. They weren't so interested, turn of the century and into the 20th century, in their Eastern European fellow Jews coming to this country, and in some respects, they even sent them out to farms and things so that they would not be embarrassed, in a sense, by this. But there is evidence in the 1860s of a day school existing at Anshe Chesed congregation, which of course is a Reformed congregation. Didn't last too long, but there is evidence of that, and I think you have those papers, Sean. Okay, so enough of that, but moving up, And going into the 1960s and 70s, those of my generation remember fully it was almost a social revolution that was going on in this country. And as part of that, the public schools were being looked at in a very revolutionary way. And we saw things such as the open schools, the influence of the British primary system, and there's lots written about it. It's a very interesting period in the history of education. So I decided to look at, okay, what was going on in Jewish education. And we were actually in the same kind of situation. And this was what led us. People were saying they were very concerned about Jewish children not being educated properly, et cetera, et cetera. And a lot of this, and I'm going very fast, led to the Commission on Jewish Continuity here in Cleveland, part of a national commission on Jewish continuity, and coming up with their report, A Time to Act. And this was an effort for the first time, I think, between the Federation and the congregations who formed a group called the Congregational Plenum, which was a group representing the congregations in Cleveland. And I, as part of my research for this, aside from researching all those documents, which I have copies of and actually lived through some of it, I had the opportunity to interview Mort Mandel, who is, a Cleveland leader with the Mandel Foundation being housed here in Cleveland. But Mort led the National Commission on Jewish Continuity, and it's very interesting, some of his insights, which will be in my chapter. But some of the things that they came up with was the idea of informal education beyond the classroom, parent and family education. Teacher education was completely changed, and as a result of the commission, we had the Cleveland Fellows program, which at the time was being led by Dan Pekarsky, who actually took a leave from the University of Wisconsin at Madison. He's a professor in the philosophy of education, to come here to Cleveland to spend 2 or 3 years getting this up and running. And we trained, very successfully trained, or educated, I should say, a group of who were known as the Cleveland Fellows. And there's still, many of them are still out working in the day schools or the congregational schools. The Congregational Enrichment Fund was founded, which was a first for the Federation to actually be able to provide money, funds, to the congregation. That was a first for sure, and that is still going on. We have community-funded positions. The Cleveland College of Jewish Studies was revitalized at that time, and you've already heard a little bit about that. We founded the Retreat Institute, which goes along with informal education, which then and now ran retreats for families, for teachers, for students, or all of the above. We started the Israel Incentive Savings Plan, which was a way for money to be saved for students in Jewish schools to be able to, and public schools actually, to be able to go to Israel. We also did a lot of work with curriculum renewal. We had Project Curriculum Renewal, which is still going on under the auspices of the Jewish Education Center. And we had a Blue Sky Task Force, which looked beyond all of this, blue skying ideas. And guess who chaired it? I did. Nothing ever came of it, which was a disappointment, but I still have hope, because the report is still available. So Another important part of this was that we all were very committed to evaluation and evaluation of these programs, which again was a new idea for those of us in Jewish education. And of course now, if you look at the gestalt of what's going on in education all over, that's the main focus, you know, with all the testing. And not that I'm advocating testing, but it was important to evaluate these programs. So we used two different groups. We used Euclides and Associates to do the first early evaluations, and then a group from Jesna continued the evaluations. And under the auspices of the JECC, we are still doing major work in evaluating Jewish education in Cleveland. And I'm using all those reports and all as background for the chapter, because it really informed practice, which is very important. There was also an important focus on Jewish studies, and as I said, Jewish studies from cradle to grave in some respects. And during this period, Peter, the silver chair was established, and subsequent to that, so this is into higher education now, subsequent to that, there was the establishment of the Samuel J. Rosenthal Center. It was not a chair at the time, which Peter also was the director of, and it offered many, I guess you would call them continuing ed programs for the Jewish community of Cleveland. And again, after some evaluation and speaking with Dina K. Cyrus Taylor and with the Rosenthal family, it sort of morphed or became another chair in Jewish studies, which is interdisciplinary, is now being held by Professor Jay Geller, who happens to be a historian, and Jay is located therefore in the history department. If it was someone in English or some other discipline, the person would be in whichever department, but would be the chair in Jewish studies. And I think at the moment, Case, once again, is looking to be able to raise the money to establish a chair in Israel studies. And that relates a lot, again, to the context, to what is going on campus these days, which for many of us is very distressing and needs to be talked about more in the whole association with anti-Semitism. And it isn't just here, it's all over the country if you follow. So, and then subsequently, as has been stated, the College of Jewish, you have to know the history in order to understand why some of these things happen. And the College of Jewish Studies or the Institute, was established during a period when professors could not get jobs in mainstream universities and things. And so it led to our being able, and even students were discriminated going back at some of the colleges and universities. So it led to the establishment of the College of Jewish Studies. No, I know. Okay. I know, I'm good about time. So I'm about to conclude. But it led to that. And then, like with the Jewish hospitals, we had a wonderful Jewish hospital in Cleveland. Mount Sinai became the Mount Sinai Medical Center. So the times changed. Doctors, professors were getting jobs all over. And so subsequently, we did a strategic plan for the college, and it was merged into lifelong learning at Case, and it has been for the last few years, and it has been doing very well. Okay, so what are the implications of all of this? And that's what I'm trying to get at. And what is history really teaching us when we evaluate and look at all of this. And, you know, there are questions about, will the special funding that came about from the Continuity Commission with a group of families in Cleveland, will that sustain? If not, what will happen with that? And will the community be committed enough to be able to continue these efforts given what is going on now in the environment? And that's also some of what I'm going to be looking at in this chapter. Jewish education has a lot to teach us, just like American education, and it's our job to learn from it and to be able to benefit and strengthen Jewish education as we move into the future. And I left you enough time for some feedback, so I want feedback.
Okay, so.
Should we come forward?
Oh, we have to come
Yes,
forward.
maybe you all should come and sit here. And there are 4 seats, so that is perfect, and I'll move, because I don't need to sit. And, okay, so again, I want to thank you all, and I am sorry for all of my popping up and suppressing your presentations, but I did want to have this time. So let's begin with questions, and I gather I should pass this microphone around. Oh, okay, Sean has one. So, yes.
So I gather from what I've heard, at least from the last 2 presentations, that Jewish education, certainly in Cleveland, and it's probably true of more of America, is really bifurcating, where you have a more Orthodox educational system on the one hand, and then secular university education on the other, neither which is necessarily closely tied to federation input. And I'm wondering if that's a correct way of thinking about things.
Well, no way is the Orthodox educational system in Cleveland divorced from federation, because, you know, just to take the example of the Hebrew Academy, its current 2014-2015 budget is approximately $8 million, of which $1.4 million comes direct from federation. So to say they're divorced is not exactly so.
I'm not sure I'd say they divorced, but I think the influence is moving away. But I
The-
wouldn't say
well,
divorced.
that
I think Sally was next, and then we'll.
Okay, I wanted to point out, which is very important, that the JECC, as it was set up, is a federation agency, not just an agency. It's part of the federation, and federation delegates to the JECC. That's the structure. The work in Jewish education, but they have to go back to the federation all the time. And the funding comes from these families, but only through the federation. So it's very connected.
I think that what we have lost is the voice of the national cultural movement in Jewish education. And to the extent that they were the architects of the structures in the early part of the 20th century, and they were the founders of the colleges of Jewish studies, most of which are either out of business or struggling. That voice has virtually disappeared. To say that everything else is Orthodox or secular, I think, does not take into account the religious denominations that have other agendas in Jewish education and who are expressing them in a variety of ways. So.
I'm also, I think you see a top-down, bottom-up pull back and forth, and there are individuals, because one of the things in delving into Friedland's career and the struggles that we saw, there were individuals who thought of their institutions as autonomous and free to just function. And there were other individuals who realized that everything in the community is very interlocking, whether it was between the Federation, the synagogues, the Jewish newspapers in that era, the communal schools, that nobody is a solo player. And I think that that's the thing that, depending on where you are in on the playing field, is how you see yourself. but none of these institutions are functioning independently, even if they might think they are.
Did you listen to something too?
One of the favorite quotes that emerged in this study is a argument between Het al. Friedland and Silver. And Silver accuses Friedland of having a godless Jewish education, and Friedland says, I will show you that there's more religion in my secular cultural institution than there is in all of your Sunday schools and religious schools. So that tension was very prominent in those days.
And the tension was reciprocated because the extreme Orthodox community also thought of Friedland as a godless
That's right,
educator.
yes,
So he was getting it from both sides of
right.
the...
From all sides, not both.
Yeah, but from all sides, indeed.
With Sylvia and Lifsa's paper, I was wondering, you mentioned, I think, a Jewish day school in one of the Reform synagogues or signs. Was that right? Oh, sorry, Sally, you did. So I'm wondering, did you find any evidence that that was because there was too much Christianity in other educational options? Was that part of the motivation?
Well, remember, this is 19th century I'm talking about, and that wasn't really within my purview. I just was giving that as background, so I really can't answer the question.
From some of my previous work, I can tell you that a lot of that was preservation of the German language. The public schools in the 19th century were not well developed yet in Cleveland, and so it was the tradition of opening your own private school.
Right.
I will say that at the beginning of my career in general education, there was a creche in the first grade class in the public school that I was assigned to teach in. And
Did they also have Bible readings and stuff?
no, we didn't have Bible readings, but
Oh,
there,
well.
but there at least, but there were such.
Improved then.
But the public school was really seen as the Protestant day school, and that was why Catholics had to create their own schools. And so I think we have to look at the historical context for these schools in many ways.
My other question was just to Ira. I was thinking a little bit about Sylvia and Lifsa's message of these interlocking organizations, and I'm wondering, because I'm only beginning to learn about Orthodoxy in Cleveland, do you also feel like there's evidence that that Orthodoxy is less isolated or insular than it might have been?
It is. There are quite a number of interconnections, and you know, I mentioned I was able to mention in my remarks Rabbi Margulies' contribution pre-Friedland to to the development of the Cleveland Hebrew schools, and there was a large segment of the Orthodox community that sent children to the Cleveland Hebrew schools, though once again, as I said, there was an extreme element in the community that talked about Friedland as an Epicurus, which from there, I managed to come across the copy of a Yiddish broadside in which he is denounced for having made a speech favorable to the heretic Baruch Spinoza at the Jewish Center of Cleveland, and do we want our children educated by such heretics?
Catherine, you had your hand up.
I have so many questions. I don't even know where to begin, but I just wanted to say it's an absolutely fascinating spectrum of talks, and I guess one of the things that comes to mind is the absence of Yiddish in the conversation, and of course there's the Arbiter Ring Schule, the Workman Circle schools. Which are you going to address?
That is in our paper.
Okay.
We just didn't get to
You
it.
didn't
but
get to it.
Yeah. One of the things that there's a big discussion of, which when we talk about the accomplishments of the Bureau, was the issue of funding for both Yeshiva Dath and for the Workman Circle School. in the early 1930s, when they're waiting for this Berkshire report to come out and Friedland is ill, the Federation skips over the Bureau and just arbitrarily decides to fund the two schools because of the Depression without any process in the Bureau. And then there's a lot of hard feeling which moves over into post-World War II in the relationships between the institutions, because everyone seems to have such long memories.
Yeah, and Yabi in particular has a very ambiguous position, and its head is on the chopping block every decade or so, and it escapes by a hair's breadth, and continued to receive Federation funding into the 1990s.
I'm sorry.
That happens to us in this community all the time. So.
The names were.
Yeah, right, okay. So for me, one of the fascinating things about the context of this work, in 1910, I think there were 20 known families in what was then Palestine who spoke Hebrew. And when Chet Aleph Friedland is beginning his work to create an intensive spoken Hebrew curriculum in Cleveland, it didn't exist anywhere else in the world. He's the father of children's literature. He was invited by the Jewish community of the land of Israel to come and be their education director. So this is pioneer work here, compared, when you think about it in the global context. And part of that context were the language wars between the people who favored Yiddish and the people who favored Hebrew, and that also gets played out in the work of Chet Aleph Friedland here in Cleveland. So
and indeed, when Chaim Nachman Bialik comes to America in, I think, 25, Cleveland is prominent on his itinerary.
because Chet Aleph Friedland lived here, and every prominent Jewish writer who came to America during those years came to Cleveland.
I can speak without that.
Well, I think they're recording you.
Oh, excuse me. All right. In that case, as an ex-professor, 45 minutes. There's an elephant in the room, and nobody has named it and talked about how we adjust to it. I have not heard any speaker use the word intermarriage, which to me is a great challenge facing continuity, and how we try to work to deal with that. And anybody's welcome to comment on that one.
Well, we're
Okay, well, let me give you a microphone so you can add to the question. And
My name's Mark Davidson. I was one of the Cleveland Fellows 20-some years ago, one of the people educated to be in this field, and happy to be part of that group, very proud of it. And I remember just what Arnie said. I mean, that was spoken and unspoken, the dragon that we were supposed to slay. Professionally, we were supposed to be a new generation of professional educators and administrators to run the schools. But the specter that drove the funding was intermarriage and the loss of Jewish culture and continuity. And I'm wondering, almost 30 years out now, in broad strokes, what does the community think of the efforts that were undertaken? I know in some areas there's been a real drop-off in activity. In other areas, there's a lot going on, and the day schools are maybe not thriving, but fairly strong. I'm just wondering in general
that sort of falls in your time zone of.
Exactly, and I talked about the Cleveland Fellows and Dan Pekarsky and all the rest. There's still many fellows involved in Jewish education. You're a good example. In Cleveland, Jewish education writ large, not necessarily, teaching in a school. And the effort's still continuing, but not at that intensity, so to speak. The program where we actually train people at the College of Jewish Studies, and you got a degree, a master's degree in Jewish education, we know is no longer existing. The college is not existing, but there are still lots of efforts taken over now by the JECC to provide professional development and what's known in the jargon as in-service training for Jewish educators.
Okay, Ira and Lipsa.
Okay, on intermarriage, and once again, I'm speaking from the perspective of my article on Orthodox Jewry. There is a kind of and once again, this is impressionistic, but there's a kind of way in which Orthodox rabbis don't have to deal directly with the issue because the issue naturally flows to the non-Orthodox rabbinate. There's a study of a conservative rabbinate, not in Cleveland, but in Worcester, Massachusetts, which makes a really important point, which is that conservative and indeed Reform and Reconstructionist rabbis get these issues thrust on them in a way that Orthodox rabbis, because people kind of know in advance an Orthodox rabbi isn't going to do anything for them. And you know what happened? There is more than one Reform marriage happening where one or both of the people are from an Orthodox background, but there are problems from a strict halachic basis.
Okay, I think Liv's had her hand up, and that'll be our last comment, and I'm sure we can continue these conversations at lunch.
I think it is correct to say that the Continuity Commission arose in part because of a population study that was done here in Cleveland that showed the significant rise in intermarriage since the 1960s. And as somebody who worked in the field, I followed Daniel Pekarsky as director of the Cleveland Fellows. We used to jokingly say that the only evaluation that was going to count was the intermarriage rate. That's how whether or not we were successful was going to be judged, not the quality of our programming or what we produced in the field. So you're correct to say that, but the period that we are addressing, that was not the issue. And I think, and the work that Dr. Robinson was addressing was also not the issue. The issue arises really in the 1990s as a factor in the work of Jewish education.
If I could say one thing, and I want to take it back to your paper. So Marcus Spiegel, who was one of these, almost brigadier general, we know he married a Quaker woman in Ohio. She's the first convert to Judaism in Chicago. He brings her back to Chicago where his family is. And so the issue is not one that's merely discovered in the late 19th century.
No, not discovered, but as a factor in the field, it was not a prominent issue.
Okay.
So thank you very much.